Over, well, let's say for quite a number of years now. It's been a number of years. The Brexiteers have been desperate to blame anyone but themselves for the way that Brexit is going. We've even had recently some actual hardcore Brexiteers come out and say, "Hmm, Brexit isn't really going as well as we thought it would." And that has been a big admission. But of course, you've got to remember that out there are a lot of very, very hardcore people who are like hardcore, like Brexiteers. One in particular, of course, is Daniel Hannan, um, who himself has had a interesting career and was at least one of the foremost people spewing Eurosceptic stuff pre-referendum years. In fact, there are many videos online of you can see Daniel Hannan making all these predictions about how good sort of leaving the European Union is, how it's going to be wonderful, about what we can do. It's going to be it's going to be magical. And all those videos exist online to this day. And yet, of course, we've also got the infamous line of when Daniel Hannan was on Sky News, I believe it was, where someone from the Remain campaign said, look, a vote to leave is a vote to leave the single market and customs union. To which Daniel Hannan instantly turns around and goes, no, a vote to leave's not that. No one is talking about leaving the single market and customs union. Only a fool would leave the single market and customs union. So imagine my shock when today we've got Daniel Hannan, along now with many of the hardcore Brexiteers, are now promoting that there is this Remainer plan to get us to rejoin the EU. And remember, who's been in charge for the past number of years? It always has been the Brexiteers in charge. We are in this mess we are currently in because of Brexiteers, because they are following this whole Brexit mantra, which people like, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage, Daniel Hannan, all claimed that if we did Brexit, it would be, the best thing since sliced bread. And I said it back in 2016 and said it continuously that they over-egged, they oversold Brexit, and that people would catch on very, very quickly that there were no positive advantages to Brexit. So let's get into Daniel Hannan's little conspiracy theory that he's got cooking up. So before we do that, though, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and one affiliation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. There's also the YouTube thank you button as well. And of course, there's the Pony Club down below as well. And as always, guys, please do remember to ring the bell as well so you get notifications when we do stuff on the channel, like drop a new video or when we go live, which sometimes I am want to do. So, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel that way. Even if you do just hit the like and share button, it helps out massively. So, over we go today to the Telegraph with Daniel Hannan's article. And the title is, "The evidence is undeniable. There really is a Remainer plan to rejoin the EU by stealth." Strap yourselves in. It's going to get good. So let's go. For 6 years, I dismissed it as a conspiracy theory. Yet, Hanan here is about to get very conspiratorial himself. An example of my fellow Brexiteers being unable to take yes for an answer. But the evidence kept piling up until I had to admit that they were onto something. There really does seem to be a plot to overturn Brexit. It's not a plot. It's you and all the other Brexiteers sold just how amazing Brexit was going to be, but it's not turning out like that. What was it? Chamber of Commerce, I believe, was on Sky News. And she was just like, look, Brexit is causing huge problems to businesses that export. And what, and how damaging it is, for these businesses not to be able to do that anymore. because who's our closest partner? It was the EU. And they were able to sell something as easily to, you know, Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam, anywhere in sort of, the single market. They could send it very easily as sending something, to London or somewhere in the UK. And that's how it was treated. It was treated as this amazing extension, this whole new market they had access to. And not only have British businesses now stopped selling to the EU because it's just either A, not worth the hassle, it's not worth the cost to do it. And we've been over the stories on this, over the businesses losing hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of business. And then you've also got EU companies who are now just going, yeah, we're not going to export to the UK anymore because, again, it's too difficult. It's, costs a lot more. And that's, and you think that's not going to have an effect on the UK economy? But hey, here we go. So let's continue with this. So I don't mean that Keir Starmer is secretly planning another vote. Yes, he spent the 2017-2019 Parliament trying to rerun the referendum, but he has wisely dropped that approach. He knows that voters don't want to reopen the issue. He knows too that the status quo advantage has flipped. Taking away what was the Remainers' single strongest card in 2016, he must also sense that an affronted EU is in no mood to offer Britain acceptable terms. This is the whole thing that, the EU is, again, out to punish us narrative that, again, a lot of, shall we say, the negative effects that Brexiteers would say, oh no, you don't understand, the EU is just punishing us. Not only that, but continuously, the EU has been in continuous moods to offer us stuff. But problem is we have had a UK government that has absolutely refused to go into any form of negotiation with the EU. Why? Because those hardcore Brexiteers, as we've seen now in the case of the Northern Ireland Protocol, where we have had some good news that these talks have been progressing in a positive direction. As soon as the Brexiteers heard about that, as far as they were concerned, as we've said it before, any negotiation with the EU is seen as a capitulation. That is what has really been going on. And because we have had that, that's why we have seen, none of these other things that the EU sort of offered to the UK being explored, accepted, or even negotiated, because we've had that government that just refuses to negotiate. You may remember Boris Johnson's government infamously said, and this came from an EU source, that they had said that, look, the UK wasn't interested in talking to the EU until 2022, and that was kind of bizarre that the UK was saying that in that regard. Why were they not interested in talking? It's because they had that hardcore Brexit mindset, and they were run by Brexiteers who were again fulfilling this bizarre fantasy plan that they had. But anyway, we'll continue. So no, the rejoiners plan is a more long-term one. First, the UK must be prevented from diverging from the EU's technical standards, which is what the Northern Ireland Protocol row is really all about. Oh. No, absolutely not, Dan. The standards argument is the longest term about this. What it is the DUP throwing their pram out of the bathwater, the pram out of the bathwater, throwing the toys out of the pram, and saying, we refuse to go into Stormont, which is causing all sorts of problems in Northern Ireland. Them not having, a basic, functioning government in Stormont, which is also causing lots of problems, and them basically trying to stoke tensions in order to get rid of the border down the Irish Sea, something that they had initially agreed to And then when they actually realized what it meant, they started to rebel pretty heavily, realizing that they had been pretty much, thrown under the bus, as they say. It's got nothing to do with trying to prevent people from diverging. Now, of course, the Brexiteers are the hardest ones to also push for this because they don't want Northern Ireland remaining in the single market customs union, because they do not want an area of the UK that is in that can be used as a clear example as, oh, look, Northern Ireland's doing really well. Why is it doing really well? Oh, because it's in the single market customs union. And we've got all this data to show and prove versus, any other area in the UK, how well it's performing. That is what they do not want. That is why they are desperate themselves to now just completely, completely, uh, destroy the Northern Ireland Protocol themselves. That is why they are desperate for this, but it's not about that at all. So he continues. So then, a future government will argue that since our right to set our own regulations is theoretical, is theoretical anyway, we might as well adopt EU standards in exchange for easier exports. Again, it it's not theoretical. We can now. We are seeing divergence take place because the Brexiteers and people in the Conservative Party are desperate to do that with their free market fundamentalism. We're seeing that happen right now, especially with the EU retained law bill. So they're trying to do the exact opposite and make it as hard as possible to perform any sort of realignment. But isn't exchange of exports easier a goal of Brexit? I mean, that's what Daniel Hannan used to say continuously, that us being in the EU made it harder to trade. But now we're out and we are seeing the numbers. It doesn't seem to be turning out that way. After that, there will be a move to rejoin the customs union. Unlike the single market, which the EU has chosen to tie the free movement of people, this could be presented to voters as an almost mechanical step, a simplification of paperwork for businesses. True, it would invalidate our trade deals, but these might be folded into new EU trade agreements, especially if Brussels concludes its negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. Again, we've only really done these two trade deals, and both of them are absolutely awful. So they're not really that good. And if the EU does do a deal with Australia and New Zealand, why not sign up to those trade deals anyway with the EU? We've seen the Brexiteers go out and perform these continuity agreements, which are basically the copy and paste rules from the EU. They're exactly the same. We've seen them done with Canada, with Mexico, Japan. So while all this is going on, Labour will sign up to as many EU initiatives as it can on everything from defence to scientific research. What's problems again with working together on these things? It's it's the pragmatic thing to do. Signing up to these initiatives loses us nothing, but gains us so much. And again, all this will be sold in pragmatic terms as cooperation with our neighbours, which it is, Dan. It is. It is very pragmatic. So right up to the moment when a future government can say, look, we're following all these policies either way, so it's downright silly not to give ourselves a say in how they are decided. At that point, rejoining will be presented as a natural, almost technical development. And ironically, Dan here has basically said what lots of us have said certainly the Labour plan seems to be getting those deals done, those alignment deals, being in those those the initiatives. Again, it's a win-win, eases trade deals. Moving back into things like, again, the customs union single market would massively help many businesses up and down the country. This is what we had said from day one, that eventually our path would just lead us back to the EU, that nothing makes sense outside the EU because all the Brexiteer arguments have come for naught. So, for what it's worth, I do not believe that such a strategy will work. Norway's politicians have been trying something very similar ever since they lost the 1994 membership referendum, and that has got them nowhere. But whether or not it succeeds, there is little doubt that the Europhile blob is giving it a go. Norway's in the single market and customs union. You know, again, the Norway option was sold by a lot of these Brexiteers as being the perfect ideal world. Oh, we'll be like Norway, said Nigel Farage. What's so bad about being like Norway? And yet, when the EU offered us that option in 2017, the Brexiteers flipped out and said, no, we don't want to be like that at all. We want to just completely leave because that's what they did. The fanatics took over and they just kept on pushing and pushing and pushing till we got to the state where we are now. Because their ideas did not work and they are proving to be that Brexit was not a good idea. So, how can I be so sure, says Daniel Hannan. After all, only this week, the Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy confirmed that it was not a Labour policy to seek membership, completing his journey from Twitter troll to mainstream politician. For a man 4 years ago who likened the Eurosceptics to Nazis, and then, when challenged, said his criticism was not strong enough. Now asserts that his priority is, quote, reconnecting Britain to Europe while remaining outside the EU. Oh no, it's like Dan has caught on that actually, the UK working together in partnership with its biggest trading partner that is literally next door is a good idea. Then again, he would say that, wouldn't he? It is through their deeds, not their words, that the rejoiners gave themselves away. Consider their approach to 4 current issues: the repeal of EU laws, the Northern Ireland Protocol, trade deals, and the economic crisis. Let's start with the retained EU law bill, which is absolutely awful. So, of course, Daniel Hanan's in favour of it. When Britain ended its unhappy, nice words there, Dan, 47-year experiment with supranationalism. Okay, that's definitely some EU skeptic language there. It decided to ease the transition by temporarily adopting all EU rules and regulations as domestic law. The idea was to offer certainty to business while taking our time to shift through the mass of rules. But as the years passed, almost nothing was disregarded. Now, you've got to ask yourself, why was that the case? Because most politicians are actually very much in favor of these regulations. We've been through this so many times, just recently as well, about when you really talk about these regulations, you can see exactly why these regulations exist in the first place, why they are there, and what they are meant to prevent, stop, or, say, hey, guys, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. Because as we've seen many times before, companies will do almost anything sometimes to dodge and get away with the rules if they can. This is why regulations exist. And yet we've got Jacob Rees-Mogg desperately trying to tear down a ton of chemical regulations concerning the British sort of chemical industry. And if you want an example of how bad deregulations of the chemical industry can get, you've only got to look at America, where there's, like, as we've said it before, there's a spill like once a month, and these spills have caused massive environmental damage, massive public health damage to public health. It's not a good direction, but this is the direction they are determined to go in, and it is one that it is not shared massively among the party because, as we said, one of the key points has always been in the Conservative Party is that there are those sensible Conservatives who do recognise the need for regulation versus those who basically just want to get rid of all regulation because they are following this crazy libertarian free market fundamentalist playbook that basically says you should get rid of all regulation regardless of what it is or what it is there to do. So anyway, let's get back to it. So almost nothing was disregarded. At least 2,400 EU laws, and I say at least because more keep turning up. So why is that a good bill then? If it started off that, it's about 4,000 now, Dan. Why is it good to just tear up all these laws within a year? That have been left on the books, he continues, some are uncontroversial, some harmful, some irrelevant. And we have laws governing relations between Danish and Norwegian fishing vessels, for example. So okay, why aren't you mentioning some of these uncontroversial ones? What are these harmful ones? And again, some irrelevant. At least you give an example for that one. Relations between Danish and Norwegian fishing vessels. Well, remember, we were in the common fisheries policy at the time. And I guarantee you, if you actually dug into that law or regulation, you can probably see exactly the reason why that is. Now, that may still actually apply to maybe UK fishing vessels that maybe fish, in those areas. It might actually be not irrelevant as Daniel Hannan claims. But hey, there you go. This is why you've got to look at these things. So, to overcome the bureaucratic inertia, ministers came up with the sensible idea of a sunset clause. No, that is not a sensible idea, Dan. Every single expert out there has basically said this sunset clause is not a sensible idea, whereby all EU rules would lapse at the end of the year unless expressly readopted. And of course, that is what the Brexiteers would do. If that bill passes, they would go crazy and just start to block hard any attempt to readopt any of those rules. And that I can guarantee you that's what we will see when that happens. I can guarantee you with the fact if this EU rule, the EU retained EU law bill passes, they will go hard to stop expressly trying to readopt any of those rules. And bear in mind, in the thing itself, to actually try and readopt any of these EU rules, the process to do it is so labyrinthine that a minotaur could get lost in its own labyrinth if it was designed like the process to go to readopt some of these EU rules. That is how much and how determined they are to stop that. So, the demand response to the proposal, not just from the opposition parties, but from civil servants, is revealing. Some claim it can't be done. Of course it can, though it might involve some Sir Humphrey actually showing up in the office. What? No, they're saying that it can't be done because there are just so many hundreds of thousands of these laws to shift through, and they don't know if this bill goes off, what laws might get deleted by accident or whatever that they just don't know about. It's got nothing to do with people having to turn up in the office, Dan. Others have averred that it is an attempt to remove workers' rights, despite the Tories having shown themselves to be far too cowardly to risk bad headlines in pursuit of even the most moderate liberalisation of the employment markets. So you can see the direction Dan would like to go in terms of stripping workers' rights. And hey, he's right. It is an attempt to remove workers' rights. Dan just gave the game away after saying, "Oh, it's being posted as an attempt to remove workers' rights," and then go, "Yeah, but they're not going to risk that, even though these moderate liberalizations of the employment market." No, they basically want no workers' rights, and yet a lot of these workers' rights that we have been said and said time and time again. One of the things we have done with a lot of these EU rules and regulations that we have built on top of these rules and regulations. The best way to describe it is like it is a house as foundations. If you get rid of the foundations, what do you think happens to the rest of the house? And what do you think happens to those laws if you've got rid of the foundations covering some of these laws? It could open up massive legal black holes and blow apart huge laws of workers' rights, environmental protection, copyright. It covers hundreds of stuff. This is why it's such a stupid idea to go for this sunset clause. It is not a good idea. But we'll continue. No, this is about risking divergence, pure and simple. Okay, except this isn't divergence. This is straight up deregulation. They are trying to sell it as, oh no, we're just going our own way. But no, the Brexiteers like Daniel Hannan, even just himself admitted this is about deregulation. We want to go on a massive deregulationary bender. That is their entire plan. So it's about resisting divergence, pure and simple. Again, no, it's not. Keeping the EU's regulations will not only make eventual re-entry easier, which it will discredit Brexit. After all, is the point of accepting a degree of trade friction as the price of the right to diverge, and then not actually diverging. Because if you diverge, those trade frictions, those bits, that bit of trade friction that you've got now becomes a lot more. That's why businesses are saying, no, please don't. Remember when Jacob Rees-Mogg was the Brexit Minister for Opportunities, and he brought in businesses to say, okay, what rules and regulations you want me to get rid of? And the British businesses came back and say, no, we don't want you getting rid of anything, thank you. Just how about that, Dan? No? So, which brings us, of course, to the Northern Ireland Protocol. I'd still argue you could probably just do an entire thing about Daniel Hannan's bizarre deregulation fetish, but there you go. What brings us then to the Northern Ireland Protocol? Perhaps the most bizarre aspect of our current debate is that people labelled the moderate and, quote, grown-up, there are those arguing for some of the most outlandish ideas ever entertained in Parliament. That the UK should have an internal border that was agreed to, Dan. You and other Brexiteers were saying how fantastic Boris Johnson's deal was. This border was in that deal. That parts of our country should be governed by foreigners, and it is wholly up to us to solve the EU's proclaimed problems. Again, this is not EU proclaimed problems. These are recognized. The EU has said, look, there are problems in the Northern Ireland Protocol. We just need to sit down. We need to negotiate them. Some are very sort of, highly technical things. We've done the data sharing agreement, which will, again, help smooth the passage along this border. But is he going to mention the Good Friday Agreement causing all these problems? Is he going to even mention that it's the DUP who are the ones kicking up the fuss about this? When you look at people who voted in Northern Ireland, people overwhelmingly voted in favour of parties who are for the Northern Ireland Protocol. So why do they push for these things? Again, to hold Britain within the EU's regulatory orbit, pending an attempt to re-entry. When, for example, they talk of, quote, finding a solution on veterinary and food standards. What they mean is agreeing to follow future Brussels rules in perpetuity, a position that in any other country would be considered beyond the pale. What? What? Okay, yes, if we do follow those veterinary and food standards, that will make things easier for us to trade. Especially when it comes to food, because food very often does not withstand these long distances that Brexiteers are determined to do trade with around the world with. makes more sense to, send food across the channel and back and forth, and following those food standards is what any other third country that wants to trade with the EU must also follow. So this is absolutely not beyond the pale. The same strategy underpins their hostility, and that's it. That's it for Northern Ireland Protocol, Dan. That's it. Oh, that's so weak. That is so weak, Dan. The same strategy underpins their hostility to trade deals with non-EU states. At first, I thought it was just sour grapes. How could anyone complain about agreements with allies as close as Australia and New Zealand? But have you actually seen the deals, Dan? Are you going to talk about these deals, about how it's a completely horrible deal for British farmers? And that this deal doesn't really work. These Australia and New Zealand are like less than 0.1%. And as someone pointed out recently, New Zealand's trade is only about 2.2% with the UK. That's nothing. The rest of its trade New Zealand does is with people in the Pacific. Because why? People trade with their closest partners first. Who is New Zealand closer to? In the Pacific, those Pacific nations. They aren't going to trade, start doing a booming trade with the UK. It's not how trade works anymore, Dan. But I now grasp that it is really about keeping the door open. Perhaps the Australia and New Zealand deals could be finessed in if the EU replicates them. Why would the EU replicate these deals with Australia and New Zealand? They are absolutely awful. They would never replicate them. In fact, we will probably see, wouldn't be too surprised, certainly in a couple of years' time, the actual EU trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, and they are probably going to be a far, far better than certainly the one we've just done. But if Britain joins the Pacific Trade Nexus, or the CPTPP, its standards will begin to diverge in earnest. This is what is panicking the continuity remain. So, wait. If we join the CTP, our standards are going to diverge. So, you are making the argument that us doing deals with the EU following their standards is bad, but if we join that Pacific trade bloc, diverging into their standards is somehow fine. Why? Why? What? So, for their scheme to even have the slightest chance of success, they need to convince the country that Brexit has been an economic disaster. And, well, it is being an economic disaster. It is not working out, Dan. We've got businesses saying how bad it is for them to do trade now. We've got clear evidence that Brexit is damaging the economy and has damaged the economy permanently. And they started almost the day after the referendum. But to their palpable annoyance, the UK kept growing faster than the EU. Oh no! Oh no! Again, that's not true. That's not true at all. It is not true at all, Dan. That is a false claim that the UK is growing faster than the EU. That is completely and utterly false. It is possible to argue that we might have grown even faster without Brexit. Wait, what? I would argue that that's not even the current case. When you look at a lot of people saying, yeah, without Brexit, we would actually be in a lot better place. As a lot of economists have said, because it's you just look at the numbers, you just look at what would have happened, But that we're growing faster than the EU, no, that is a completely false claim, Dan. Where are the numbers? Where's your information backing that up? But that was not their claim. Their claim was that leaving the EU had ruined us, and in making it, They made themselves look both spiteful and silly. It's not absolutely the case at all. We've got the numbers. They ain't good, Dan. You're the one that now looks, well, I don't know, a sore loser, I suppose. But there you go. Then, on the very day that Brexit came into effect 3 years ago, this Tuesday, the first two cases of COVID were reported. Oh, okay, so here we go. There we go. That's it. Oh, it's all to do with the pandemic. It's the pandemic. Just ignore the fact we've got all these examples of this. It's all to do with the pandemic, guys. Don't worry about it. So, when the first cases of COVID reported in the UK, a pair of Chinese nationals in New York, within 7 weeks, Britain had disregarded its level-headed peacetime epidemic plan. Panicked by fear-mongering and modelers and shrieking journalists, ministers placed their country under house arrest. So Dan would have not wanted us to go into lockdown. Where you look at the other countries that did not go into lockdown and did not do lockdown, they had far more deaths. Yeah, our pandemic response under Dan's plan, we would have had far more excess deaths, far more. So this time, the economic consequences truly were ruinous. Indeed, the things Remainers had prophesied during the referendum started coming to pass. Yes, because shockingly, as we said, if we do not have the clear open access that we used to, there will be problems. So, bare shelves, grounded flights, shuttered businesses, almost every country suffered these things, but we suffered them a lot worse. And of course, those that locked down during the hardest are the worst affected. Now, economically, yes, because that's what you are doing to stop the spread of the pandemic, Dan. It wasn't about protecting the economy, it was about protecting people's lives. Something that Dan would basically is clear admitting here that the workers of the UK should have been sacrificed in favor of trying to maintain the economy, which would have led to a far worse health outcome for the whole of the UK. Those affected, Sweden and the United States took only a light economic hit. Again, they love to go to Sweden. So first of all, Sweden has a massive social safety net, even better, I would say, than the one we've got here in the UK. So if people did get sick, they were covered. And Sweden did eventually go into lockdown because it had to. But it was able to put off going to lockdown so much because they had these social safety net covers that people like Dan do not want to bring up. That is why Sweden was so able to not go to put off going into lockdown. But it did do lockdown procedures, and it did do things like social distancing and mask wearing as well. Again, this is the thing that a lot of these, COVID wasn't as bad as they claim it was, love to go on about Sweden, but they don't actually really talk about the reality that happened in Sweden. And of course, the United States. The United States, I believe, has one of the worst death tolls of COVID still. And again, he's only took a light economic hit in what? A favor of the thousands of people that died because of the pandemic. Was it worth it? It's not a moral case you're making there, Dan. I'm not going to lie. So Germany and the Netherlands were more badly damaged. And oh, by the way, Germany and the Netherlands bounced back faster after the COVID than anywhere else. I wonder why. And of course, the most severe pain was in 2020. It was felt by the countries that imposed the most severe restrictions: the UK, Spain, and Italy. Of course, again, he's trying to sort of, again, blame it all on the pandemic. But again, the further we get from the pandemic, the worse it is to go and say, oh, it's all the pandemic's fault. But they're going to blame this for years. Even when we might be, 2026, they'll still be blaming the the effects of the pandemic on why Brexit is not doing well. They'll look absolutely like lunatics. But Even Dan knows he can only make this argument maybe until the end of this year. But after like 2023, the more they make this argument, the less ridiculous they look. So Britain went on to make up some ground, partly as a result of the faster vaccination. Not true, other countries vaccinated faster than us, and partly because it was bouncing back from a lower place. Jeez. Easy to justify growth. Yeah, we dropped down to like -10, but we gained like 10 points. That still puts you at zero. It still puts you at zero. Plus, again, you look at other countries, they've bounced back better and they've done a lot better than us. We are still the only economy that has not recovered to its pre-pandemic state. So in 2021 and 2022, it was the fastest growing economy in the G7. No, please cite your numbers on that, Dan, because I've seen other numbers from a lot more trusting experts that say otherwise. None of this had anything to do with Brexit, he cries, when it absolutely did. One of the things we said in 2016 was that Brexit would open up to some more economic shocks. And what was the pandemic except a massive economic shock? Any more than with the energy shock occasioned by the war in Ukraine. And again, that has shocked our economy. There is a reason why we are in an energy crisis now. Are other countries suffering this as well? Yes, but nowhere to near the extent that we are. Brexit was always going to carry a transitional cost, but that wasn't the case you made at the referendum. You said it would be amazing, but he's about to rewrite history now. During the referendum, I likened it to moving house. Except that is like the worst analogy ever when you were moving house, because again, Dan said in Dan's world, from what he said back in 2016, and this is why I say there's like this pre-referendum Daniel Hannan, there's this referendum Daniel Hannan that exists, and then since then there's been like these multiple copies of Daniel Hannan, almost as if he is like the Batman villain Two-Face, and he's parroting different things constantly to whatever tries to fit his narrative whenever he wants. Again, the house moving narrative does not work, because if it is, again, the 2016 Daniel Hannan was pretty much saying, okay, we're basically moving next door. We're still staying on, Customs Union and Market Street, we're just moving next door. It'll be easy. But of course, that's not what happened. So however much more pleasant your new home is, the move itself is bound to be stressful. And as most people who've moved house will tell you, it is, can be a bit stressful moving, but that doesn't last forever. Once you are in, it goes away very, very quickly. And to be honest, we've been out of the EU now for 3 years. We've seen the effects economically going on since 2016. It's not going good. It's not going as well as you guys would say. This is like, turning up to a new house and you're like, well, where's all the furniture? You said the furniture would be here by now. Where is it? And they're like, oh, don't worry, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Don't worry. In about 50 years' time, the furniture will turn up. said Jacob Rees-Mogg. But rejoiners have systematically and cynically conflated the cost with the vastly greater cost of lockdown, which in most cases they themselves demanded. Yes, because we weren't idiots, and we were far, far more in favor of making a public health case than trying to defend the economy. Because making the moral case for this, trying to defend the economy, is not one you should be making, Dan. Makes you look absolutely ridiculous. And backed by sympathetic broadcasters, and they are making headway in a country where no party has wanted to level with voters about the calamitous consequences of the closures. Yeah, Dan will bang on about that forever. I think we'll be 6 or 7 years out of out of out of the pandemic, and yet Dan will continue to bang on about these terrible closures, and that's why even in 2027 we're still suffering. 'Cause Brexit always implied a trade-off. Short-term Short-term disruption, again, heavy in quotation marks, I think you should by that, versus the long-term gains. Again, what gains? There certainly are no long-term gains, or at least one that you are talking about, uh, of more competitive regulations and a freer global trade. Again, what do you mean by competitive regulations? This is what, again, these people who want deregulation try to disguise it as. They just, oh no, you don't understand. These regulations, they're not competitive. We've got to make them more competitive, which basically just means deregulating. And again, freer global trade. Well, we've seen other countries around the world bounce back on this global trade index. Neither is the UK. Caught on to that. Not only that, but our global trade is down as a percentage down. So much for global Britain. So, do rejoiners truly plan to accept the first and then forfeit the second? I'm afraid that no other explanation fits the facts. You've spun your own facts very, very well there in that piece there, Dan. Um, that is a masterpiece in certainly trying to deflect from the realities that Brexit has caused. I mean, bear in mind, in that entire piece we've just gone through, you have not seen one piece of data. There's no numbers. There's no Dan isn't citing any other expert to maybe back up his position or anything like that. This is just an absolute fantasy piece. Daniel Hannan sat down one day, put on his tinfoil hat, and decided, I'm going to sort of join in with the other Brexiteers and start spinning the conspiracy theory that we're going to, be rejoining the EU by stealth. But of course, like I say, this is of course part of the Telegraph or the Torygraph, pick your name for it. To try and again spin to their readers about why, really Brexit's going amazing. It's going all right, guys. Don't worry about it. Bear in mind something else we might go over. we might go over it. Dan wrote another piece, I think, for the Washington Examiner 6 days before this piece, saying, don't believe anyone who says anything negative about, post-Brexit Britain. In reality, it's all going fine. And bear in mind, you've seen here how he quotes with no statistics, no facts, no data. Everything that I've given you, you can go look up for yourself. It's all out there. We've gone over the articles before on this channel. And yet, here he is, still desperate to try and sort of prove that his precious project is working when it actually has nothing to back it up. Nothing. And yet, people like Hanan, Morg, Michael Gove, Boris, all were out there claiming Brexit would work almost instantly. It would be fantastic. And then we get into the thing with diverging. Most conservatives are somewhat sane when it comes to regulations, luckily. The free market fundamentalist part of the party isn't that big, very luckily, or else certainly Liz Truss would have lasted a lot longer than she did. But yeah, they are very, very well aware about this is why we have regulations. It is just this free market fundamentalist faction, which again Dan is part of. They say, no, we need to just get rid of all regulations, or we need to make them more competitive. And when you actually cite, I'll give Dan this. Dan actually cited a quote irrelevant piece of regulation. Again, judging the relationship between sort of Norwegian and Danish fishing boats. There may be a legitimate reason to actually keep that. I don't know what the full regulation, of course, says. But Even if that is an irrelevant piece of legislation, it does not justify the EU retained law bill and the sunset clause just ripping out hundreds of thousands of potential EU laws that could blow massive holes in the British statute book. It does not justify Daniel Hannan going, oh, actually, all our economic problems are down to the pandemic. Now, yes, the pandemic has caused us some economic problems, but it is not solely responsible for them all. Brexit has made it worse. And we always said Brexit would act like a foot on the problems that the UK was facing, because, as we always said, problems of the UK never caused by the EU. Yet, here we are now. Dan continuing making this ridiculous case. It is basically an outlandish conspiracy theory about this, but hey, there you go. And of course, then bizarrely say that we should have sacrificed, actually not bizarrely, so not surprisingly, because of course, Dan was pretty much matching all these other right-wing libertarians who are like, no, you don't understand, we shouldn't be locking down, we should be sending people to work. That way, the virus can spread out as much as possible and then do even more economic harm to just, again, look what happened to the UK under Donald Trump versus those states that did and didn't lock down, and the economic impact that it had. Yes, it had an economic impact on those states that did lock down, but those states that didn't lock down and still said, yeah, you can crack on, go to work, it had an even bigger economic impact. So, yeah. That's Daniel Hanan's bizarre, insane conspiracy theory about why we're trying to secretly rejoin the EU. But anyway, wow, this has been a long one. So, as always, guys, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like and share button. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.